But, I took a nap. I can go ahead and read some more out of our book, Augustine, The City of God Against the Pagans, edited by R.W. Dyson. We are in Book 3, Chapter 12. And I just have to say, I have really been enjoying this book tremendously. But also, Martyr's Mirror, because it seems like, especially where we're at in Martyr's Mirror, um, what's the word I'm looking for? These two seem to mesh really well, I guess you want to say, because they're still in the 100s there, and this was actually written in the 300s. So I just think that's really neat, because it's like we get, a bird's eye view, or a firsthand account on a lot of things with Augustine. Oh, hush now. Chapter 12. How many gods the Romans added in addition to those established by Numa, and that such a quantity of gods helped them? Not at all. Rome did not, however, think it proper to rest content with the rites established by Pamphilus, even though they were so numerous. Jupiter did not yet have his supreme temple. It was Tarquin, the king, who erected the Capitol. Asclepius, let's see, Asclepius also left Epidaurus for Rome, so that this most accomplished physician might practice his art with greater glory in the noblest of cities. The mother of the gods came from Pasinus. I do not know where that is, he put in parentheses, for it was unworthy, now that her son presided at the Capitoline Hill, that she should still be hidden in some unworthy place. If, however, she is the mother of all the gods, she not only followed some of her children to Rome, but also preceded others who were soon to follow her. But I wonder if she herself gave birth to Cynophilus, who long afterwards came from Egypt, and whether the goddess Fever, who also born of her, is a matter for her grandson Alcicopius to decide. Whatever the circumstances of her own birth may have been, however, no foreign gods will, I suppose, presume to call ignoble a goddess who is a Roman citizen. Who then can count the many gods who thus protected Rome? Native gods and alien, celestial, terrestrial, gods of the infernal regions, of the seas, of fountains, of rivers, and as Varro says, gods certain and uncertain, and in every class, just as among the animals, male and female gods, founded as she was under the tutelage of so many gods. Rome surely should not have been assailed and afflicted by such great and horrible calamities, of which I shall mention only a few out of the many. For by the great smoke of her sacrifices, as by a given signal, she summoned to her protection all the many gods for whom she established and provided temples, altars, sacrifices, and priests, thereby offending, however, the most high and true God, to whom alone these rites were justly due. In fact, Rome had lived more happily when she had fewer gods, but as she became greater, she considered that she should acquire more gods, just as a bigger ship needs more sailors. She despaired, I believe, of those few gods under whom, in comparison with her worse life to come, she had lived well, deeming them insufficient for the defense of her greatness. Even under the kings, however, with the exception of Numa Pamphilus, of whom I have already spoken above, there was wicked and discordant rivalry among the Romans from the first, rivalry of the kind which had brought about the slaying of Romulus's brother. Chapter 13. By what right or treaty the Romans obtained their first wives. Also, how is it that neither Juno, who with her husband Jupiter cherished the Romans, lords of the world, the nations of the toga, nor even Venus could help the sons of Aeneas, not Aeneas, God help me, Jesus, Aeneas, maybe? Aeneas. You pronounce it, because I can't. to acquire wives for themselves by good and just means. So complete was the helplessness of the gods that the Romans seized their women by force. Thus, they were soon compelled to fight with their father in law and the miserable women, not yet reconciled to the injury done them by their husbands, now received their father's blood as dowry. In that conflict, the Romans indeed conquered their neighbors, but such victories were purchased only with great injuries to kinsfolk and neighbors alike and many burials. The war between Caesar and Pompey was waged between only one father in law and one son in law. Yet, even here, when Caesar's daughter, Pompey's wife, died, Lucan was moved by deep and righteous grief to cry out, "The struggle on Emathia's plains is worse than civil war. Our song is one of wickedness claiming to be just." The Romans therefore conquered so that they might, with hands imbued with the blood of fathers, wrest embraces from their sorrowing daughters. I don't think I read that right. The Romans, therefore, conquered so that they might, with hands imbued with the blood of fathers, wrist embraces from their sorrowing daughters. For their part, the daughters did not dare to mourn for their slain fathers for fear of offending their victorious husbands. Indeed, while the battle was being waged, they did not know whom to pray for. It was not Venus, but Belliona, who bestowed such marriages upon the Romans. Or perhaps that hellish fury, Alcato, had more license to harm them now that Juno was helping them than she had when Juno's prayers incited her against Aeneas. Let's say Aeneas. That sounds good. A, a drama, Andromache was happier in her captivity than those Roman brides were at their weddings. For though Andromache was a slave, yet after he had embraced her, Pyrrhus slew no more Trojans. The Romans, however, still slew in battle the fathers-in-law whose daughters they had embraced in the marriage bed. Andromache, even though enslaved by the victor, had need only to mourn and not to fear the death of her people. But the Sabine women, related as they were to both the warring parties, feared the death of their fathers when their husbands went forth to battle, and mourned it when they returned, yet were not at liberty to either fear or mourn. For either they were tormented by dutiful grief at the destruction of their fellow citizens, kinfolk, brothers, and fathers, or they cruelly rejoiced in the victories of their husbands. Moreover, since the fortunes of war are fickle, some of them lost their husbands by the sword of their parents, while others lost parent and husband together by each other's swords. Nor indeed were these crises any small matter from the Romans themselves. Eventually, they arrived at a stage where their city was being besieged and they were defending it from behind closed gates. Then, when these gates were opened by deception and the enemy admitted within the walls, a dreadful and most atrocious battle was fought in the forum itself, a battle between fathers-in-law and son-in-law. The abductors were overcome and fleeing in great numbers among the houses, gravely besmirched with, no, greatly gravely. I'm going to have to get my little marker to follow the sentence. Gravely besmirched their earlier victories, even though these victories were themselves shameful and deplorable. At this point, however, Romulus, now despairing of the courage of his men, prayed to Jupiter that they might stand fast, and from this occasion Jupiter received his title of Stator. Stator, Stator. But the evil day would not have ended even there had not the ravished women dashed out with flying hair and flinging themselves down before their fathers, stilled their just anger, not by force of arms, but with pious supplication. Romulus, who had been unwilling to accept his own brother as his fellow ruler, was then forced to accept Titus Tatius, king of the Sabines, as his colleague. But how long would he tolerate this arrangement when he could not endure even his own brother? And so Tatius, being slain, Romulus became sole king, so that he might presently become a still greater god, small g. What marriage laws were these? What incitements to war? What ties of kinship, affinity, fellowship, or divinity? And finally, what a civic life under the tutelage of so many gods. You see how many weighty things might be said here, were it not our purpose to deal with matters as yet outstanding, for the sake of which we must now hasten our discourse on to other topics. Chapter 14. Of the impiety of the war which the Romans waged against the Albans, and of the victories gained through their lust for mastery. After Numa, what occurred next under the other kings? What a great evil it was when the Albanes were provoked into war, not only for them, but for the Romans also. And this came to pass, no doubt, because the long peace of Numa had come to seem little worth. How frequently were massacres suffered by the Roman and Albane armies alike, and how great was the impoverishment of both cities. For that very Alba which Acaneus, the son of Anis, had founded, a city which was more truly Rome's mother than Troy, was provoked into conflict by the Roman king Tullus Hostilius. And in that conflict she both suffered and inflicted harm, until both sides wearied of so many clashes in which each suffered equally. Then they resolved to determine the outcome of the war by a contest of two sets of three brothers, one set from each side. From the Roman ranks there came forth the three Hortae, let's say Hortae, and from the Alban there came Curitae. Two of the Hortae were slain by the three Curitae, but the remaining Horatius, Horatius defeated and killed the three Curitaes, and so Rome emerged victorious, but at such disastrous cost that even in the final contest, only one of the six returned home. And who suffered the loss on both sides? Whom did such grief befall but the stock of Aeneas? God help me. I am so sorry, guys. I don't know why I get so tickled over that. I should a nice. I don't know. The posterity of Acanius, the offspring of Venus, the grandsons of Jupiter, question mark. For when daughter city fought with mother city, this was indeed a state of affairs worse than civil war. To the final combat of the sets of three brothers, there was added another atrocious and horrible evil. For at first the two peoples had been friends, being indeed both neighbors and kin, and a sister of the Hortai had been betrothed to one of the Curtai. But because she afterwards wept when she saw the arms of her betrothed borne home as spoils by her victorious brother, she was slain by that same brother. To my mind, this one woman, who showed such affection, had more humanity than the entire Roman people. I do not judge her worthy of blame for weeping over the man to whom she already owed half her faith. Perhaps, indeed, she also wept for the brother who had slain the man to whom he had promised his sister. Why is it, then, that in Virgil, Aeneas the pious is found worthy of praise for mourning an enemy whom he had killed with his own hand? Why did Marcellus weep with compassion when he contemplated the city of Syracuse, when he reflected that but a moment ago it had been at the height of its glory, and then had been suddenly destroyed by his own hand, and when he contemplated the common lot of mankind? Surely, in the name of human affection, we may entreat that, if men are to be praised for weeping over enemies whom they themselves have vanquished, a woman may without reproach weep for her betrothed, slain by her own brother. Yet while that woman was mourning the death of her betrothed at the hand of her brother, Rome herself was rejoicing that she had waged war against her mother city with such great slaughter, and had conquered by the effusion of so much kindred blood on both sides. Why do our adversaries plead the words praise and victory to me? Take off the cloak of vain opinion, and let such evil deeds be examined naked. Let them be weighed naked and judged naked. Let the cause against Alba be stated, just as that of adultery was stated against Troy. No such cause is to be found, however, no similar charge. The only reason for the war was so that Tullus might move his idle people to war and march his unaccustomed troops to victory. It was because of this wrongful purpose, then, that the great wickedness of war between allies and kinsmen was perpetuated. Solus touches in passing upon this great crime. First, he commemorates the briefly praises those more ancient when men lived out their lives without covetousness, and each man was well enough pleased with what was his. He then says, but afterwards, when Cyrus in Asia and the Spartans and Athenians in Greece began to subdue cities and nations, had to deem lust for mastery a sufficient reason for war, and to hold that the greatest glory belongs to the greatest empire. And so on with the rest of what he had resolved to say. For my purpose, it is enough to quote only these words. This lust for mastery disturbs and consumes the human race with great ills. Rome was conquered by this lust when she triumphed over Alba, and in praising her own crime, she called it glory. For as our scripture says, the wicked boasteth of his heart's desire, and blesseth the covetous, whom the Lord abhorreth. What are you doing, Charlie? Come on. What are you doing? Come on. Don't be nosy. Come on. Away then with concealments and deceitful whitewashings. Let these things be examined openly. Let no one tell me that this man or that man was great because he fought with some man or another and conquered him. Gladiators also fight, and they also conquer. This cruelty, too, has its rewards of praise, although it would, I think, be better to pay the penalty for any amount of slothfulness than to seek glory in such feats of arms. But if two gladiators were to enter the arena to fight, one a son and the other his father, who could endure such a spectacle? Who would not shun it? How, then, could the clash of arms between two cities be glorious when one of the cities was a mother and the other her daughter? Did it make a difference that there was no arena and that broader battlefields understand that what? I think I skipped it. Yeah, I did. Battlefields were filled with bodies, not of two gladiators, but of multitudes belonging to two peoples. Did it matter that those struggles were encircled, not by an amphitheater, but by the whole world? Did it matter that they furnished an ungodly spectacle both to those then alive and for as long as their fame is handed down to their posterity also? The gods who presided over the Roman Empire were like theatrical spectators at these struggles. They remained quite unmoved when the sister of the Hortiz was added by her own brother's sword to the two brothers slain. They were not moved when she became a third victim on the other side, a victim to match the three slain Curtes, so that Rome, even though she was the conqueror, might sustain no fewer deaths than the conquered. Then, as the fruit of victory, Alba was destroyed, after Ilium had been destroyed by the Greeks, and when they had left Lavinium, where Annas had established a vagrant and fleeting kingdom, the Trojan divinities occupied Alba as their third dwelling place. But Alba herself, or itself, was then overthrown, because, perhaps in their customary fashion, the gods now departed from it also. Clearly, all the gods upon whom this realm stood have gone, forsaking shrine and altar. They departed, indeed, and from a third dwelling place, so that Rome, you see, might be thought all the more provident in becoming their fourth. For whereas Alba, where Amulus had expelled his brother, displeased them, Rome, where Romulus slew his brother in order to reign, pleased them. But our adversaries say, before Alba was destroyed, its people were transferred to Rome, so that one city might be made out of both. So be it then, this was done. But that city, Achaea's kingdom, and the third home of the Trojan gods, a mother city, was still destroyed by her own daughter. Moreover, before the survivors of the war could form one miserable lump out of the two peoples, much blood was shed on both sides. But why should I tell one instance at a time of the frequent renewal of these same wars under the other kings? They seem to end in victory, yet they culminated time and time again in great slaughters. And time again, after treaties of peace had been concluded between fathers-in-law and son-in-laws, and their stock and posterity, the wars were renewed once more. No small indication of this calamitous state of affairs is to be found in the fact that none of these kings closed the gates of war. None of them then reigned in peace, even though protected by so many gods. Chapter 15. How the Roman kings lived and died. How, moreover, did the kings themselves meet their ends? A flattering fable says of Romulus that he was caught up and received into heaven. Some Roman authors, however, say that he was hacked to pieces by the Senate for his ferocity. The story is that a certain Julius Proculus was suborned to say that Romulus had appeared to him and through him commanded the Roman people to worship him as one of the divine beings. In this way, it is said, the people who had begun to swell with anger against the Senate were suppressed and calmed. For an eclipse of the sun had also occurred, and the ignorant multitude, not knowing that this happens according to the determinate laws of the sun's own movement, attributed it to the merits of Romulus. But this withdrawal of the sun's light, this indication of the sun's grief, should surely rather have been interpreted as a sign that Romulus had been murdered. Indeed, a similar sign appeared when the Lord was crucified by the cruel and impious Jews. But that this latter concealment of the sun did not come about through the natural movement of the heavenly bodies is sufficiently shown by the fact that it took place during the Passover of the Jews. For this festival is held at full moon, whereas eclipses of the sun normally happen only at the last quarter of the moon. Cicero also shows plainly enough that Romulus' reception into the company of the gods was more believed in than real. Even while praising him in his book De Republica, he says, in the person of Scipio, so great were his attainments that, when he suddenly disappeared during an eclipse of the sun, he was believed to have been translated into the number of the gods, and his opinion could not have been held of any mortal without the highest reputation for virtue. By the words suddenly disappeared, we are here surely to understand that he was removed either by the violence of a storm or by vile murder. For others of the writers mention a sudden storm in addition to the eclipse of the sun, a storm which certainly either furnished or an occasion for the crime or itself swallowed Romulus up. Hold on 1 minute. Excuse me, thank you. Again, speaking of Tullus Hostilius, who was the third king of Rome and who was himself destroyed by lightning. Cicero says in the same book that he was not believed to have been received among the gods even though he died as he did. Perhaps Cicero suggests this was because the Romans did not wish to have what they agreed or believed in the case of Romulus to be made vulgar or commonplace, as it would have been if it had been readily attributed to another also. Again, in one of his invectives, Cicero says clearly, Romulus, who founded this city, we have raised up to the immortal gods by our goodwill and renown. That's crazy. This suggests that Romulus's elevation did not truly occur, but was a polite fiction devised and published in recognition of his virtues. In the dialogue, Hortensius, moreover, while speaking of regular eclipses of the sun, Cicero says that they produce the same darkness that was produced at the time of Romulus's death, which occurred when the sun was hidden. And then it has a footnote number, only fragments of this dialogue survive. It was an exhortation to the study of philosophy. Augustine refers to it frequently and tells us that reading it played a large part in his conversion to Christianity. Here, certainly, he does not in the least shrink from speaking of the man's death, for he is engaged in discussion rather than praise. With the exceptions of Numa Pompilius and Ancus Martius, both of whom died natural causes, the other kings of the Roman people also met dreadful ends. Tullus Hostilius, the conqueror and destroyer of Alba, was, as I have said, consumed by lightning, along with his whole household. Tarquinius Priscus was slain by the sons of his predecessor. Servius Tullius was slain by the vile wickedness of his son-in-law Tarquinius Superbus, who succeeded him in the kingdom. Even when such parricide was perpetuated against Rome's best king, however, the gods did not forsake the shrines and altars of Rome. It is said that they were driven to do this in the case of unhappy Troy, whom they abandoned to destruction and fire, but by the mere adultery of Paris. Yet in Rome's case, that very Tarquin, who had murdered his father-in-law, then succeeded him, and the gods certainly did not abandon this wicked parricide, who reigned only because he had murdered his father-in-law. Indeed, he triumphed in many glorious wars and built the capital from the spoils. The gods did not depart from him then. Rather, remaining where they were content that Jupiter, their own king, should preside and rule in the loftiest temple which the parricide had built. The Tarquinians did not build the capital while he was still innocent and then suffer expulsion from the city subsequently for later wrongdoings. On the contrary, that very kingdom in the midst of which he built the capital came to him only through the commission of a most abominable crime. And when the Romans did eventually drive him out of the kingdom and expel him from within the city walls, this was the crime against Lucretia, which was not his own, but the offense of his son. Indeed, it was committed not only through his father's knowledge, but even in his absence. Tarquinius was then laying siege to the city of Ardea, waging war on behalf of the Roman people, and we do not know what he would have done if the evil deed of his son had been brought to his notice. Nonetheless, without seeking or asserting his judgment in the matter, the people deprived him of his authority. They closed their gates against him as soon as the army, which had been ordered to desert him, had been admitted, and when he returned, they refused to grant him entry. Then, having exhausted the Roman people by the most disastrous wars, during which he appealed to their neighbors against them, he lived quietly as a private citizen in the town of Tusculum near Rome for 14 years, accompanied only by his wife. It is said that he failed to recover his kingdom because he had been abandoned by those whom he had trusted to help him. Such an end was, no doubt, preferable to that of his father-in-law, slain by his son-in-law with, it is said, the connivance of his own daughter. But this Tarquin the Romans called not the cruel, not the infamous, but the proud, perhaps because in their own pride they could not bear the pride of another. Yet so lightly did they regard his crime in murdering the best of their kings, his own father-in-law, that they made him their king. I wonder, indeed, if it was not a greater crime on their part to confer so great a reward on so great a crime. Yet still the gods did not forsake the shrines and altars of Rome, although perhaps someone will say, in defense of those gods, that they remained at Rome rather to inflict punishments on the Romans than to confer benefits, to punish them by seducing them with empty victories and consuming them with dire wars. This, then, was the life of the Romans under the kings during the vaunted age of the Commonwealth, which ended with the expulsion of Tarquinius Superbus, a period of some 243 years. During this time, all those victories, purchased with so much bloodshed and such calamity, extended Rome's dominion scarcely 20 miles from the city. So small a territory is now hardly to be compared even with that of any Galician city. Chapter 16. Of the first Roman consul, one of whom expelled the other, and soon afterwards perished by a wound inflicted by a wounded enemy, after the most atrocious parricide. And I believe parricide is when they kill their parent. I believe that's what that is. To that age, let us add also the time during which, as Solus says, equitable and just laws were still being enacted. The period, that is, which lasted until fear of Tarquin had abated and the grievous war with Ertura was over. For as long as the Etruscans gave assistance to Tarquin in his endeavor to regain the kingdom, Rome was smitten by grievous warfare. Equitable and just laws therefore prevailed. Solus says, not because the Commonwealth was devoted to justice, but only because she was hard-pressed by her enemies. In this briefest of periods, How disastrous a year was that in which the first consuls were created after expulsion of the kings. Indeed, they did not complete their year. First, Junius Brutus ejected his colleague Lucius Tarquinius Collentinus from the city in disgrace. Shortly afterwards, he himself fell in battle, he and his foe mutually wounded. But he had first slain his own sons and the brothers of his wife because he had discovered that they were conspiring to restore Tarquin. This deed Virgil subsequently records with praise, yet he immediately shudders as it is his clemency. At it in his clemency. He says first, when their father found his children fomenting new wars, he punished them himself for the sake of fair liberty. But then, shortly afterwards, he exclaims, but what an unhappy man this is, no matter how much his deed may be celebrated in days to come. In other words, however greatly posterity may praise and extol the man who slew his own sons, he is, Virgil says, still unhappy. Then, as if to console this unhappy man, he adds, but love of country drove him and the immense love of praise. This Brutus, therefore, slew his own sons and the son of Tarquin, also his enemy. He could not, however, survive his exchange of blows with the latter. Indeed, he was outlived by Tarquin himself. In this fate of Brutus, then is not the innocence of his colleague Colonidas seen to be vindicated. That Colonidas, who, though a good citizen, suffered, after Tarquin had been banished, the same punishment as the tyrant Tarquin himself. For Brutus himself is said to have been of the blood of Tarquin also. What brought about the downfall of Collinus, however, was the similarity of his name to that of the king, for Collentinus was also called Tarquinius. He should therefore have been required to change his name, not his fatherland. After all, the word could have been removed from his name. He could have been called simply L. Colonitus. Why, therefore, did he not lose what he might have lost with no detriment? The only effect of his keeping his name was that he was ordered to be deprived of his office, even though he was one of the first consuls, and his citizenship, even though he was a good citizen. Does this then redound to the glory of Junius Brutus, this iniquity, both detestable in itself and of no profit to the commonwealth? Did he perpetuate this crime because driven by love of country and the immense love of praise? When the tyrant Tarquin had been expelled, L. Tarquinius Colonitus, the husband of Lucretia, was created consul jointly with Brutus. How just the people were in paying heed to the morals of a citizen rather than his name. By contrast, how impious Brutus was in depriving of his fatherland and honor his first colleague in that office, when he might have deprived him of his name only, if that name gave scandal. And these wicked deeds were done, these evils occurred, when equitable and just laws prevailed in that commonwealth. Lucretius also, who was chosen to replace Brutus, was removed by sickness before the year was ended. Thus, Publius Valerius, who succeeded Colonitus, and Marcus Horatius, who was chosen in place of the deceased Lucretius, completed that deathly and infernal year, which had 5 consuls, the year in which the Roman Commonwealth inaugurated the new honor and office of the consulate. There's a lot of people dying. Chapter 17. Of the ills by which Roman Commonwealth was vexed after the inauguration of the consulate, while no help was offered by the gods whom the Romans worshipped. This, as fears gradually diminished, not because the wars ceased, but because they ceased to be so grievous a burden. The time when equitable and just laws prevailed came to an end. It was followed by the state of affairs which Solus briefly depicts. Thereafter, the Particians, is that what it is? Partitions? Treated the common people as their slaves, and dealt with their lives and bodies after the fashion of kings, driving them from their fields and lording it over those who were destitute of land. The common people, oppressed by these cruelties, especially by high rates of interest, and at the same time, what's the matter? You whining? Oh. At the same time, bearing the burden of taxation and the military service in the ceaseless wars, withdrew under arms to the sacred hill and the Aventine, and so presently secured for themselves the tribunes of the people and other rights. But the end of discord and strife on both sides was brought about only by the Second Punic War. But why should I now spend time in writing of such things, or make others spend it in reading them? Solus has sexually explained how wretched the Roman Commonwealth was during all the long years down to the Second Punic War, when foreign wars and internal discords and seditions never ceased to distract it. The victories in which it rejoiced, therefore, were not the solid joys of the fortunate, but the vain comforts of miserable men. They were no more than beguiling temptations to seek only one barren evil after another. And let not good and prudent Romans be angered because we say this. Indeed, we need not ask this or make such an appeal to them, for it is quite certain that they will not bear us any ill will. After all, we speak no more severely and mention no fault more grave than their own authors do, although we are certainly not their equal in style and facility. Oh, what is it, honey? I don't know what's going on, guys. I'm going to have to stop, I think, and come back. What is it? She's whining. So, I'm sorry, guys. I'm going to have to stop here in chapter 17 of book 3 in the middle. I'm so very sorry. I got to take care of this dog. She's whining. So, until then, keep your eyes on Jesus, brothers and sisters. Your nose in the book, which is the Word of God. And let us embed the Word of God upon the tablets of our hearts, so you and I will not sin against God. Love y'all. Bye-bye. Okay, hold on, sweetheart.